Hello, dear members of the Soul Stories family. Today we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Part 1. The Initial Relationship. Rain poured heavily on the narrow street, the golden light from the cafe spilling out through the misty glass, casting blurred streaks of brightness into the dark night. Elena Harper stood there, under the freezing downpour, clutching a gray umbrella tightly in her hand but not opening it. Rainwater streamed down her soft brown hair, soaking through her thin coat and drenching her white canvas shoes. But she didn't care. Her eyes were fixed on the scene inside the cafe, where Mason Bennett sat across from a stranger, a radiant smile on his lips. That smile, Elena had seen it hundreds of times over the past 10 years. It had appeared when he completed an outstanding design in college, when he secured his first contract for his architecture firm, and even when he shared trivial stories from his life with her. But now that smile wasn't for her. It belonged to the blonde girl sitting opposite him, who tilted her head and giggled, brushing her hair with a graceful gesture. Elena gripped the umbrella handle tighter, a sharp pang spreading through her chest like the cold raindrops falling onto her shoulders. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a text from Mason. "Elena, where are you? I need your opinion on this gift. Does she like necklaces or earrings more?" She peered through the glass, seeing him holding a small red box, probably the gift he intended for that girl. Her fingers trembled as she typed a reply. "I'm busy, you decide." But just as she sent it, she heard familiar footsteps. Mason pushed open the cafe door and stepped out, his dark gray vest hugging his tall frame, his sharp brown eyes scanning the street. And then their gazes met through the rain. "Elena," his voice rang out, tinged with surprise and a hint of irritation. "What are you doing here?" She flinched, quickly turning her face away, scrambling for a lie. I was just passing by." Rainwater ran down her cheeks, mingling with something salty she didn't want to admit was tears. Mason frowned, stepping closer and pulling her under the cafe's awning. "You're so foolish, standing in this rain without cover. Look at you, you're soaked." He brushed the droplets off her shoulders, a familiar gesture he'd done hundreds of times before, but he didn't know, never knew, that she'd been standing there for over an hour just to catch one more glimpse of him, even from afar. She gave a faint smile, the forced one she'd practiced too many times in the mirror to hide her sadness. "I'm fine. Go back inside, don't keep her waiting." Mason shrugged, as carefree as ever. "It's done anyway. I'll drive you home, it's on the way." Without waiting for her response, he tugged her hand toward the car parked a few meters away. Elena let him lead her, her wet shoes leaving faint marks on the pavement. She told herself that as long as he was happy, she didn't need anything more. But how many times had she repeated that to herself? They first met on an autumn afternoon at university, exactly 10 years ago. Mason, then a second-year architecture student, was tall, handsome, but oddly clumsy. He dropped an entire stack of drawings onto the lecture hall floor, white sheets scattering amid the laughter of his classmates. Elena, the petite girl sitting at the back, quietly bent down to pick up each one, stacking them neatly before handing them to him. He looked at her, scratching his head awkwardly. "Thanks. What's your name?" "Elena," she replied softly. "It's nothing." From that moment, her heart no longer belonged to her. She didn't know what about him stirred her. Perhaps it was the sharp yet warm look in his eyes when he focused on drawing, or the way he stubbornly redid a design for the 10th time just to perfect it. She only knew that being near him made her feel more alive, even though he never saw her the way she saw him. They became friends, then best friends, at least in Mason's eyes. To him, Elena was the most reliable person, always there when he needed her, always listening, always helping without asking for anything in return. But for Elena, each day by his side was a small cut in her heart, deepening over the years. She vividly remembered a night 8 years ago when Mason had just failed a major design competition. He sat curled up on the sofa in her small apartment, holding the coffee she'd made, his eyes red from exhaustion. "I can't do anything right," he said, his voice hoarse. Elena sat beside him, silently taking a pencil and paper, sketching his idea anew, refining every tiny detail while he dozed off on her shoulder. By morning, she placed the finished drawing in front of him, smiling. "Try again." He looked at her, surprised, and said simply, "Thanks, Elena. You're my savior." But he didn't know she'd stayed up all night, not for the work, but for him. Another memory, more painful, was from 3 years ago, when she stood in the rain waiting for him. Mason had just broken up with his ex, a beautiful girl who betrayed him for someone else. He called her at midnight, his voice slurred with alcohol. "Can you pick me up? I don't want to go home alone." She drove across half the city in a torrential downpour, finding him huddled under an awning, an empty bottle rolling by his feet. She helped him into the car, letting him slump against her shoulder without a word, though the rain soaked through her clothes. All the way back, he mumbled about the pain of betrayal, never once asking how far she'd driven or why her hands were so cold. He just leaned on her, as if it were a habit. Elena Harper, 28, was a talented interior designer who brought warmth to any space she touched. She had soft brown hair, deep blue eyes like the sea, and a gentle smile everyone adored. But few knew that behind her radiant exterior was a heart full of scars. Scars she willingly bore for someone who never noticed her love. She sacrificed silently, not because she expected reciprocation, but because she couldn't imagine a life without Mason in it. Mason Bennett, 30, was the CEO of a prestigious architecture firm, a man so cold and rational he sometimes seemed distant. He was tall, with neat black hair and sharp brown eyes that could see through every detail, except Elena's heart. He didn't believe in love, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. 5 years ago, his ex-fiancée had left him right before their wedding for someone wealthier. Since then, he'd built a wall around himself, letting only Elena, his best friend, pass through without knocking. But he didn't know that each time she did, she left a piece of her heart behind that wall. On the drive home after that rainy evening, the silence between them was stifling. Mason drove, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing at Elena, who sat huddled in the passenger seat. Her wet coat dripped onto the car floor, but she said nothing, just stared out the window where raindrops slid down the glass. "I think she's pretty interesting," Mason suddenly said, his tone casual as if discussing the weather. "That girl earlier, she works in fashion, talks funny too, but I'm not sure if I should see her again. What do you think?" Elena bit her lip, trying to keep her voice steady. "Up to you. If you like her, go ahead." She faked a yawn, hiding the eyes misting over with a familiar feeling, the sensation of being left behind. Mason chuckled softly, oblivious to the subtle shift in her tone. "You're always like that, never giving me a straight opinion. But you're the one I trust most. I'd be lost without you." She didn't reply, just offered a faint smile, her hand gripping the edge of her coat. Those words, she'd heard them so many times. They were sweet like honey, yet bitter like medicine, because they never carried the meaning she longed for. The car stopped in front of Elena's apartment. She reached for the door, but Mason suddenly spoke. "Tomorrow I've got an important company party. The partners keep trying to set me up with their daughter. It's driving me crazy. Come with me, okay? I need someone I can count on." Elena turned back, looking into his eyes. Those eyes, as always, held no flicker of emotion beyond pure trust. She knew agreeing meant stepping into another wound, playing the fake girlfriend, standing by him but never truly his. But she couldn't refuse. She never could. "Sure," she nodded, her voice a soft whisper. "What time will you pick me up?" 7 p.m. Mason grinned, pleased. "Thanks, Elena. I knew I could count on you." She stepped out of the car. The rain had stopped, but the cold clung to her. Watching Mason's car disappear into the darkness, she wondered, what would that party bring? And why did he always need her, yet never truly see her? She stood there under the dim streetlight, her heart heavy with an unanswered question. Part 2. The Pretend Kiss. That evening, when the clock struck 7, Mason was already at Elena's apartment door, just as he'd promised in the car the day before. He rang the bell, standing there with a relaxed demeanor in a dark gray vest that hugged his tall frame. his black hair neatly combed. Elena opened the door, stepping out in an emerald green evening gown she'd chosen that morning, a color she knew he liked, though he'd never said it aloud. She'd spent the whole day preparing, not because she expected anything from this party, but because she wanted, just once, to stand beside him as someone truly special. But when Mason looked at her, he only nodded and smiled. "You look beautiful. Thanks for agreeing to come with me tonight." Elena forced a smile, her hand clutching the small clutch tightly. "It's nothing. You need me." The words were gentle, but in her heart they weighed heavy like a confession that would never be heard. They arrived at the Grand Lux Hotel, where Mason's company was holding its lavish party. The dazzling chandeliers cast light across the banquet hall, reflecting off wine glasses and silver cutlery. The soft sound of a piano blended with the lively chatter of the guests, businessmen, architects, and major partners. Mason led Elena inside, his hand resting lightly on her back, guiding her to the main table. "Remember," he whispered as they wove through the crowd, "just act like we're a couple. I don't want that old partner shoving his daughter at me." She nodded, her heart stinging when he said, "Just act like." She'd known this since yesterday, when he asked her to come along because he needed someone reliable. But knowing and accepting were two entirely different things. She wore a beautiful dress, held his arm, smiled at the guests' compliments. "You two make a great pair. She's a real gem, Mason." But each praise only deepened her pain. She wasn't his gem, wasn't his lover. She was just Elena, the best friend always there when he needed her. Mason, on the other hand, seemed at ease. He shook hands with partners, introduced her to everyone. "This is Elena, the most important person to me." He said it naturally, without hesitation, but didn't notice her eyes dimming. Important, but not in the way she dreamed of. She held a glass of wine, taking a small sip to hide her trembling hands, while he kept talking and laughing, as if her presence beside him was a given. The party continued in that pretense for a while, until the main doors swung open. A familiar figure stepped in, the sound of high heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor, drawing many eyes. It was Sophia, Mason's ex, who had abandoned him 5 years ago right before their wedding to chase a richer man. She was as stunning as ever, her golden hair perfectly curled, her red lips curved in an arrogant smile. Sophia glided through the crowd, her gaze locking onto Mason like a cat spotting prey. "Mason Bennett," she said, her voice sweet but dripping with mockery. "Didn't expect to see you here. Still lonely as ever, huh? I thought you'd have found someone to fill the void I left by now." Elena felt Mason's body tense beside her. He gripped his wine glass tightly, his knuckles whitening, but his face retained its usual cold composure. "Sophia," he replied evenly, "I don't think you're in any position to talk about that." Sophia laughed loudly, her voice echoing over the background music. "Oh, don't be mad. I'm just surprised. Someone like you, rich, handsome, and still no one's caught your eye?" She tilted her head, her gaze sliding to Elena, as if noticing her for the first time. "Oh, or is this little best friend still playing the substitute? How pitiful!" Her words hit Elena like a punch to the chest. She wanted to retort, to defend herself, but her throat tightened. Mason, however, couldn't take it any longer. He set his glass down on the table, pulled Elena close, his arm wrapping around her waist so naturally she couldn't react. "You're wrong," he said, his voice icy. "Elena isn't a substitute. She's my girlfriend." Sophia raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but before she could say more, Mason leaned down and pressed his lips to Elena's. The kiss came suddenly, strong and deeper than he'd intended. At first it was just a light touch, part of the act he'd staged to counter Sophia. But then his lips lingered longer, his breath mingling with hers, his hand tightening around her waist as if he didn't want to let go. The crowd fell silent for a few seconds, then erupted in applause, a few people whistling playfully. Elena froze. Her heart pounded wildly, blood rushing to her ears as if to drown out all sound. She felt the warmth of his lips, the familiar woody scent of his cologne, and for a fleeting, mad moment, she thought it was real, that he truly wanted her, truly loved her. But then he pulled away, turning to Sophia with a challenging look. "See?" he said, his tone casual, like he'd just closed a deal. "I'm not as lonely as you think." Sophia smirked, clearly caught off guard, but she quickly regained her haughty air. "Well played, Mason. I hope you two are happy." She turned on her heel, leaving the sound of her heels fading into the distance. Elena stood there, her lips still burning, her mind spinning. She looked up at Mason, hoping to catch something in his eyes, a spark of emotion, a sign that the kiss wasn't just pretend. But he only smiled lightly, patting her shoulder like a brother. "Just an act," he said, his voice gentle but cutting like a knife. "Thanks, Elena. You're the best." She didn't respond. She couldn't. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she bit her lip, forcing them back. I'm going to get some water," she whispered, then turned and hurried away from the table, her heels unsteady on the floor. She found a secluded corner behind a large curtain where the lights didn't reach, and let the tears fall. She wiped them with the back of her hand, but they kept coming, unstoppable. That kiss, the moment she dreamed of for 10 years, was just a performance, and she was once again the fool on stage. From a distance, Mason caught a glimpse of her silhouette behind the curtain. He saw her head bowed, her shoulders trembling, and an unease crept into his chest. Why would she cry over that, he wondered, but then dismissed it. She's probably just tired, he told himself, turning back to chat with a partner as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, something stirred, a feeling he couldn't name. On the drive home, the air in the car was heavier than ever. Elena sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze distant out the window. Mason drove, glancing at her now and then, but unsure what to say. He felt unsettled, not because of Sophia, not because of the party, but because of her unusual silence, the way she avoided his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with a hint of worry. She nodded without turning. "I'm fine." But her voice quivered, and her eyes, though he couldn't see them, were clouded with tears she fought to hold back. Mason frowned. He didn't understand why she was like this. The kiss. He'd pulled it off perfectly, hadn't he? He'd saved them both from an awkward situation, and she'd agreed to help him yesterday. So why was she so distant? He wanted to ask, but he stayed quiet. He told himself it was just acting, that the lingering heat on his lips was just the after effect of wine and adrenaline. But deep down, he couldn't deny that the kiss felt unlike anything he'd experienced. Not like with Sophia, not like with anyone. It felt more real than he'd expected, and that confused him. When the car stopped in front of Elena's place, she opened the door and stepped out without another word. Mason called after her, "Sleep well, thanks for tonight." She only nodded, her small figure disappearing behind the apartment door. He sat in the car for a few more minutes, his hands still on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the closed door. He didn't know why, but for the first time in 10 years, he felt a strange emptiness as she walked away. Part 3. When Secret Love Becomes Pain. After the night of the party, Elena was no longer the Elena Mason once knew so well. That pretend kiss, though it lasted only a few seconds, had left a deep crack in her heart, not because it wasn't real, but because it felt so real to her, yet meant nothing to him. Mason's words, "just an act," echoed in her mind all night, like a verdict reminding her that her 10 years of unrequited love were nothing but a one-sided dream that would never come true. She lay in bed, staring at the blank white ceiling, and for the first time in years she asked herself, how much longer can I keep doing this? The next morning she stood before the mirror, gazing into her deep blue eyes, now clouded from lack of sleep. She brushed back her brown hair, tying it up high, and made a decision. She needed to distance herself from Mason, not because she hated him, but because she needed to learn to love herself more than she chased after someone who never saw her. Her phone buzzed, his name lighting up the screen, but she didn't answer. She let it ring until it stopped, then sent a short message. "I'm busy with work for a few days, don't call me." As the text sent, she turned off her phone, feeling as though she'd just severed a part of herself. Mason, on the other end, sat in his spacious office, staring at the message with his brows tightly furrowed. Busy with work, he muttered, tapping his fingers on the desk. He wasn't used to Elena being so distant. For 10 years, she'd always been the one to answer his calls right away, always there whenever he needed her. He tried calling again, but all he heard was the long, empty tone. An uneasy feeling crept into his chest, as if he'd just lost something familiar he'd never paid attention to before. In the days that followed, Elena truly vanished from his life. She didn't show up at the usual cafe where they often met, didn't reply to his texts, and when he drove by her apartment one late evening, the windows were dark, not a single light on. He stood downstairs looking up, hands in his pockets, telling himself, she's probably really busy. But deep down, he began to feel a growing unease. Without Elena by his side, everything seemed strangely empty. He picked up his phone to text her something, but then deleted it. He didn't know what to say because he'd never had to think about keeping her close. She'd always been there, like an unquestioned part of his life. Meanwhile, Elena tried to build a new life for herself. She took on more interior design projects, working late into the night to leave no time to think about Mason. She told herself this was the only way to forget him, to stop her heart from aching every time she recalled that kiss. But each time her phone lit up with his name, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying. She didn't want to be away from him, but she couldn't stay near him anymore. Not when he only saw her as a friend, as someone reliable, not someone he loved. A week later, Mason unexpectedly saw Elena again at a meeting with a mutual client. She appeared in the conference room, dressed in an elegant gray suit, her hair tied up neatly, a gentle but distant smile on her lips. He sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her, but she didn't look at him, not once. She chatted with Mark, a new male colleague at the company, who had a friendly smile and eyes clearly drawn to her. They laughed and talked about a detail in the project, Elena tilting her head and nodding, looking more at ease than ever. Mason felt a hot surge run down his spine. He gripped the pen in his hand tightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched Mark pat Elena's shoulder in a friendly gesture. He didn't understand why he was so irritated. Who was Mark anyway? Just some ordinary colleague, nothing special. But when Elena smiled at him, a smile Mason had once thought was only for him, he couldn't take it anymore. The meeting ended, and as everyone left the room, Mason stood up, striding quickly to where Elena was gathering her papers. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her out into the hallway, his voice sharp. "Who's that guy?" Elena startled, looking up at him. Her deep blue eyes flashed with surprise, then quickly turned cold. "Who?" she asked, her tone flat. "The guy you were laughing with in there," Mason replied, still holding her wrist tightly, his gaze darkening with a feeling he couldn't name. She pulled her hand free, stepping back. "Mark, just a colleague. Why do you care?" Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of mockery in it. Mason frowned, the unease in his chest rising. I was just asking. Since when are you so close to him?" Elena looked at him, her gaze colder than he'd ever seen. "Just a friend, like you and me," she said, emphasizing the last words as if to stab at his heart. Then she turned and walked away without looking back, leaving him standing there, his chest heavy with a feeling he'd never experienced before. Jealousy. He returned to his office, slumping into his chair, rubbing his forehead. "Like you and me," her words echoed in his mind. Why did that make him angry? Why did he care that she smiled at someone else? He told himself it was just because he was used to having her around, used to her presence in his life. But that reason wasn't enough to ease the restlessness gnawing at him. A few days later, an unexpected event pulled them both into a whirlwind of new emotions. Elena was working at an interior design site on the city's outskirts, a 2-story wooden house she'd designed herself. She stood on a ladder checking the ceiling details, when a wooden beam suddenly fell from the upper floor due to a mistake by the construction crew. She raised her arm to shield herself instinctively, but the beam struck her hard, knocking her off the ladder. A sharp crack sounded as she hit the floor, clutching her bleeding left arm, the pain so intense she couldn't move. The crew panicked, calling an ambulance, and one of them, someone who happened to know her connection to Mason, phoned him. Mason was in his office reviewing a blueprint when his phone rang. The caller spoke quickly. "Elena had an accident at the site. She's badly hurt in the arm, being taken to St. Mary's hospital. Mason dropped his pen, jumping to his feet, his face paling. What? How is she? He shouted into the phone, but the caller only said, "Get there now," before hanging up. He rushed out of the office, not bothering to grab his coat, leapt into his car, and sped to the hospital. His heart pounded, his mind reeling with images of Elena lying motionless somewhere. He didn't know why he was so afraid, but the thought of losing her made it hard to breathe. When he reached the hospital, Elena was on an emergency bed, her left arm temporarily bandaged, her face pale from pain. He burst through the door, yelling at the doctor nearby. "How is she? Why isn't anyone helping her right now?" His voice boomed through the room, startling a few nurses. The doctor reassured him. "She's fine, just a minor arm fracture and some cuts. We're waiting for an x-ray." But Mason didn't listen. He rushed to her bedside, sitting down beside her, his trembling hand touching her uninjured arm. "How are you? Does it hurt a lot?" he asked, his voice hoarse with worry. Elena opened her eyes, looking at him, surprised by his frantic expression. She gave a weak smile, trying to hide the pain. "I'm okay. It's just a small accident." Mason said nothing, just bent down, grabbing a roll of gauze from the nearby tray and starting to bandage her cuts without waiting for a nurse. His movements were clumsy, his hands shaking so much he had to redo it twice, but he didn't stop. Elena watched him, her heart softening at this unexpected care, then asked in a whisper, "Why do you care so much?" Mason paused, looking up at her. His eyes were full of worry, but he couldn't answer. He wanted to say something, that he didn't know, that it was instinct, that he couldn't imagine what would happen if she weren't okay. But the words stuck in his throat. He just silently continued bandaging her arm, his gaze never leaving her pale face. When the doctor returned, Mason stood up but didn't leave. He stayed by the bed, watching as Elena was taken for an x-ray, his heart heavy. He didn't understand why he'd reacted so strongly, why the thought of losing her scared him more than anything in his life. He told himself it was just because she was his best friend. But deep inside, a small voice began to whisper that maybe, just maybe, she was more than that. Are you still following the stories from Soul Stories? Share your thoughts and feelings about today's story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more meaningful and heartfelt stories from Soul Stories. Part 4, Misunderstanding and Rift. After the accident at the construction site, Elena could no longer pretend everything was fine. The pretend kiss at the party, the distance she'd imposed on herself, and even Mason's worried gaze when he rushed to the hospital, all of it pierced her heart like knives, both sweet and painful. She lay in the hospital bed, her left arm wrapped in stark white bandages, staring out the window at the gray sky drifting silently by. Mason had stayed at the hospital all afternoon that day, sitting beside her without saying much, quietly checking every small detail, as if afraid she'd vanish if he looked away. But when she asked, "Why do you care so much?" and he didn't answer, she realized that his concern wasn't love, at least not the love she'd been waiting for over 10 years. She was discharged after 2 days, her arm still aching, but her spirit utterly drained. Mason offered to drive her home, but she declined, citing a need to rest alone. He looked at her, his brows furrowing as if he wanted to say something, but in the end he just nodded. "Rest well. Call me if you need anything." She gave a faint smile, turned, and walked away, her small figure disappearing behind the apartment door, leaving him standing there with an unnamed unease. Back home, Elena sat on the sofa, looking around the familiar room where she'd shared countless moments with Mason. The nights he came over to watch movies, the times he fell asleep on the chair while they worked together, the mornings she made coffee for him before he headed to the office. Now they were just faded memories, like dim streaks of light through a window pane. She realized she couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep staying by his side, hoping one day he'd see her differently, when he only viewed her as a friend, a reliable person he could call anytime. She stood up, grabbed her laptop, and opened her email. A work assignment in Paris had just come in from a partner company, an opportunity to design the interior of a luxurious boutique hotel. It would last 3 months, long enough for her to leave this city, leave Mason, and perhaps leave behind the unrequited love that had held her captive for too long. She replied to the email, confirming her participation, then began packing. Each item she placed in her suitcase was a reminder to herself. This is for me, not for him. Before leaving, she sat at the table, took a sheet of paper and a pen. She wanted to leave a note for Mason, not to explain, but to close the chapter of the 10 years she'd given him. Her hand trembled as she wrote, tears falling and blurring some of the words, but she didn't stop. Mason, for 10 years I've tried to be by your side, not because I wanted you to return my feelings, but because I couldn't imagine my life without you in it. I stood in the rain waiting for you, stayed up all night to help you, laughed when you were happy and cried when you were sad, all because I loved you, even though you never knew. But I'm tired, Mason. I can't keep looking at you the way you never look at me. I need to learn to live for myself, not chase a dream that isn't real. Thank you for all those years. Goodbye. She folded the letter, placed it in a white envelope, and left it on the kitchen table, where he often sat when he visited. She dragged her suitcase to the door, took one last look at the apartment, then stepped outside, locking the door without turning back. Her flight took off the next morning, carrying her to a distant place where she hoped she could rediscover herself. Mason didn't know Elena had left until 2 days later. He called her a few times after her discharge, but she didn't pick up, only replying with brief texts. I'm fine, don't worry. He assumed she needed time to recover from the accident, so he didn't push. But on the third day when he drove to her apartment intending to bring some food, a bad feeling crept over him. The windows were dark, not a single light on, and when he rang the bell, no one answered. He used the spare key she'd once given him. In case you need a place to crash, she'd said with a gentle smile, and stepped inside. The room felt oddly empty, devoid of her familiar footsteps, the faint coffee scent she often brewed. He called out, Elena! But only an echo replied. He walked into the kitchen, and that's when he saw the white envelope on the table. His hands shook as he opened it, his sharp brown eyes scanning each line. With every word she wrote, his heart felt like it was being squeezed. For 10 years, I've tried to be by your side. He read, and images flooded back. Her standing in the rain, staying up all night to redraw his ruined designs, silently wiping tears after that pretend kiss, all replaying like a slow-motion film. I loved you, even though you never knew. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. Loved him? Elena loved him? Since when? And why had he never noticed? When he reached the final word, goodbye, he dropped the letter onto the table, hands clutching his head, his face pale. He was stunned, feeling true fear for the first time, not of failing at work, not of betrayal like with Sophia, but of losing Elena forever. He shot to his feet, running through the apartment as if searching for some trace of her, but there was nothing but emptiness. She was gone, and he didn't know where. He sank onto the sofa, his hand instinctively picking up the white ceramic mug she used to use when visiting his place, the one she'd left behind after a late-night movie session. He gripped it tightly, as if it were the last piece of her left in his life. He sat there for hours, eyes fixed on the mug, memories flooding back, memories he'd overlooked in his own carelessness. He recalled their first meeting at university, when she picked up his drawings with that gentle smile. He remembered the nights she sat by him, fixing every tiny detail in his botched designs without a single complaint. He remembered her standing in the rain to pick him up after Sophia left, her cold hands still holding him so he wouldn't feel alone. And he remembered the pretend kiss at the party, the softness of her lips, her breath mingling with his, and the way his heart raced, though he tried to ignore it. Since when did she become everything to me? He asked himself, his hoarse voice breaking the silence of the empty room. He didn't have an exact answer, but he knew she'd always been there, quietly filling the gaps in his life he hadn't noticed. He'd grown used to her presence, her smile, the fact that she was always the one he turned to when things went wrong. But now with her gone, he felt like he'd lost a part of himself. He stood, still clutching the mug, his eyes darkening with a new resolve. He couldn't let her go like this. He couldn't let her 10 years, and his own, end with a goodbye on paper. He fumbled for his phone, calling his assistant. Find out where Elena Harper is. She just took a work assignment. I need to know now. His voice was firm, but his heart trembled with the fear that it might be too late. He sat back on the sofa, Elena's letter beside him, and told himself, I'll find you, Elena. I can't lose you. But in his heart, a question lingered. Would he make it in time? Part 5. When secret love is no longer one-sided. Mason couldn't bear another minute after reading Elena's letter. That letter, with its trembling handwriting and ink smudged by tears, struck his heart like a knife, waking him from a 10-year dream of indifference. He had let her drift away, let her suffer alone, and now, with her no longer by his side, he realized she was everything he needed. He couldn't sit still, couldn't let her vanish from his life like a passing breeze. That very night, he called his assistant, his voice so urgent it nearly trembled. Find out where Elena Harper is. She's on a work assignment, and I need to know exactly where, right now. His assistant, though startled by the unusual intensity in his tone, asked no questions and got to work immediately. A few hours later, the answer came. Elena was in Paris, working on an interior design project at the boutique hotel Le Clair de Lune, about 30 minutes' drive from the city center. Mason didn't hesitate. He rushed out of the apartment, heading to the airport with just a small backpack and Elena's letter, the one thing he clutched tightly as a reminder of what he'd lost. He booked the earliest flight, heedless of the cost or the chaotic work schedule piling up at the company. On the 10-hour flight, he didn't sleep, his gaze fixed on the window, where white clouds drifted by like memories of her. He recalled the time she stood in the rain waiting for him, her cold hand still holding him tight. He remembered her gentle smile when she picked up his drawings in college, and he remembered the pretend kiss at the party, the softness of her lips, her breath mingling with his, and the way his heart raced, though he'd tried to ignore it. How foolish I've been, he muttered to himself, his hand gripping the letter until it crumpled. The plane landed in Paris as dusk was settling in, the fiery sunset painting the city in warm hues. Mason didn't rest. He rented a car and drove straight to the address his assistant had given him. He parked a few dozen meters from the site, not wanting her to notice him yet. Through the car window, he saw her. Elena stood amid a wooden house under construction, wearing a long gray coat, her brown hair tied up neatly, holding a design board and directing the workers. She tilted her head, smiling at a worker who asked her something, her eyes shining in the sunset, a beauty of strength and confidence he'd never noticed before. Mason sat silently in the car, his hands tightening on the steering wheel, his breathing heavy. She was no longer the small girl who always stood behind him, quietly sacrificing for his sake. She had changed, found her own strength in the distance he'd unwittingly forced upon her. He'd once thought she'd always be there, the steadfast best friend he could lean on. But now, seeing her in the Paris twilight, he realized how beautiful and precious she was, and how close he'd come to losing her forever. A mix of pride and pain welled up in his chest. He wondered, do I even deserve her after everything I've overlooked? He took a deep breath, opened the car door and stepped out. His shoes crunched on the dry ground, each step slow but resolute. Elena didn't see him, still engrossed in her work, her voice soft yet firm as she instructed the crew. This column needs to shift a bit to the left so more natural light can come in. Mason stopped a few meters away, his eyes never leaving her. He wanted to call her name, but his throat tightened, his heart pounding as if it might burst. Then she turned, perhaps from instinct, perhaps from the unfamiliar sound of footsteps. When her eyes met his, she froze. The design board nearly slipped from her hands, her deep blue eyes widening in shock. "Mason?" she whispered, her voice trembling, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. What are you doing here?" Mason didn't answer right away. He closed the distance in a few quick strides, pulling her into his arms before she could react. His arms wrapped tightly around her, as if he feared she'd dissolve if he let go. Elena stood still, her body stiff in his embrace, her breath catching from the suddenness. She felt his warmth, the familiar woody scent of his cologne, and for a moment she thought she was dreaming, like the dreams she'd had for 10 years where he finally saw her. He leaned down, whispering into her ear, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How long have you loved me?" The question pierced her heart like a gentle knife, carrying both pain and hope. Elena looked up at him, and for the first time in 10 years she saw something different. Not the usual indifference or coldness, but sincerity, anguish, and a fierce longing. She gave a sad smile, faint like the moonlight outside, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. "A long time," she replied, her voice so soft it nearly faded into the wind. "Since the day I picked up your drawings in college. But you don't need to know that, Mason. It doesn't matter anymore." Mason shook his head, his hands lifting her face, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "No, I need to know," he said, his voice firm yet trembling. "I need to know everything, Elena. I've been blind, so foolish that I didn't see you, didn't see your love for all these 10 years. I let you stand in the rain, let you cry alone, let you walk away from me without doing anything. But now I see, and I can't let you go anymore." Elena's eyes widened, tears falling faster, but she didn't look away. She wanted to believe him, but 10 years of pain had taught her to doubt. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice shaking like a plea. "Or is this just another time you need me to get you through something? Are you sure, Mason? Because I can't take another hurt." Mason didn't answer with words. He leaned down, pressing his lips to hers, this time not pretending. The kiss was slow, tender, yet intense, as if he were pouring all the emotions he'd suppressed into it: regret for his years of obliviousness, the desperate need to keep her, in the love he'd only just recognized. Elena stood still, her breath blending with his, then slowly closed her eyes, her hands instinctively clutching his shirt, returning the kiss with everything she'd held back for a decade. Her tears fell, soaking into his shirt, but this time not from pain, but from joy. When he pulled away, he cradled her face in his hands, his gaze locked on hers. "I was a fool not to see it sooner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I love you, Elena. I don't know when it started, but I know I can't live without you. I lost you once when you left, and I don't want to lose you again. Don't leave me anymore, please." Elena sobbed aloud, not from sadness, but because for the first time in 10 years, she felt his love, not through casual words or friendly gestures, but through his earnest eyes and the warmth of his embrace. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, but a smile finally bloomed on her lips, radiant like the moonlight outside. "I won't leave," she whispered, resting her head against his chest, listening to his heart beat strong and steady. Mason held her tighter, his hands stroking her hair gently, as if to make up for all the years he'd missed. Under the Paris sky turning to night, they stood there, two hearts finally beating as one after a long journey of hurt and hope. Elena's silent love was no longer unrequited. It had been returned, and this time it was forever. Part 6. A perfect ending. A year had passed since the day Mason found Elena in Paris, and in those 365 days their lives had changed in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. After that moment when he pulled her into his arms under the Parisian sunset sky, they didn't rush back home right away. Elena completed her project at Le Clair de Lune, but this time Mason stayed with her. He put his work at the architecture firm on hold, flying back and forth between Paris and their hometown just to be near her. He didn't want to waste another day making up for the 10 years he'd been oblivious. Those first months in Paris were a time for them to get to know each other again. Not as friends, but as lovers. Mason learned to see Elena with new eyes, noticing the small things he'd once overlooked. The way she furrowed her brow when focusing on a design, the way she giggled when he clumsily tried to make coffee, and the way her deep blue eyes lit up whenever he said, "I love you." Elena, in turn, learned to trust his love. She'd once feared it was just a fleeting impulse, that he'd soon revert to his old coldness. But with each passing day, he proved he was serious, through unexpected hand-holding, texts checking in during work hours, and nights sitting by her side, listening to her share dreams she'd once kept hidden. When the Paris project ended, they returned to their hometown together. Elena no longer lived in her old apartment, the one where she'd left her goodbye letter. Instead, she moved in with Mason in his spacious penthouse, which had a rooftop terrace overlooking the city. They turned that terrace into a shared space. Elena planted small potted plants, while Mason set up a long table where they worked late into the night. It was the same place they'd sat together in college, where Elena quietly sketched designs to help him without asking for anything, and now it became a symbol of their new beginning. Their life together wasn't always perfect. At times, Mason would unintentionally slip back into his old cold habits, and Elena had to remind him she was no longer just a best friend who silently endured. Sometimes Elena would wake startled in the middle of the night, dreaming he'd left her like in the past, and Mason would hold her tight, whispering, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." But through each challenge, they learned to love each other more deeply, more honestly, and to cherish one another more. On a spring evening, exactly 1 year after Mason flew to Paris to find Elena, he decided it was time to turn their love into a forever promise. He planned to propose, not in a fancy restaurant or under the romantic Eiffel Tower, but on their rooftop terrace where it all began, where he'd once failed to see her, and now where he wanted to keep her forever. He prepared from early morning while Elena was busy at her design studio. Mason had his assistant bring strings of small lights, hanging them around the terrace like twinkling stars. He set up a small table in the center, draped it with a white cloth, and placed a bottle of her favorite wine there. In his vest pocket, he carefully kept a ring box containing a ring he'd chosen weeks ago with an emerald stone matching her eyes, and another special item, the old sketchbook she'd drawn for him in college. He'd kept it all these years, not for its work value, but because it was the first mark of the silent love he hadn't recognized. When Elena came home that evening, Mason met her at the door, his eyes shining unusually bright. "Come with me for a bit," he said, taking her hand and leading her to the terrace. Elena was surprised but smiled, letting him guide her without questions. When the terrace door opened, she stopped short. The lights glimmered like a starry night. The air carried the faint scent of flowers from her plants, and Mason stood there, in a simple black vest, but radiating a rare seriousness. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and delight. Mason didn't answer right away. He pulled her to the center of the terrace, where the lights illuminated her face, making her blue eyes sparkle more than ever. He took a deep breath, then knelt before her, his left hand holding the ring box, his right offering the worn sketchbook he'd kept all these years. "Elena," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I'm not good with fancy words, but I want you to know I've been wrong so much in the past. I didn't see you, didn't see your love, and I let you hurt for 10 years. But when you walked away, I realized you were everything to me. My friend, my savior from myself, and the person I love more than anything in the world." He opened the sketchbook, pointing to the rough sketches she'd made for him in college. "I kept this because it meant more than I ever realized," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "It was the start of us, even if I didn't know it then. And now, I want it to be a promise that I'll never let you go again." Elena stood silent, tears quietly welling up. She looked at the sketchbook, remembering the nights she sat by him, drawing every small detail just to see him smile. She hadn't known he'd kept it, hadn't imagined it meant anything to him like this. Mason opened the ring box, the emerald stone glinting under the lights. He took her hand, his voice trembling but resolute. "That pretend kiss wasn't pretend to me, Elena. From that moment, I didn't want to let you go, even though I was too foolish to realize it. I love you, and I want to spend my life proving it. Will you marry me?" Time seemed to stop. Elena looked at him, at the man who'd broken her heart for 10 years, but who now knelt before her with all the sincerity and love she'd once dreamed of. She burst into tears, but this time from happiness. She nodded, her voice choked. "Yes." Mason stood, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she'd vanish. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her, a deep, sweet kiss. Not a pretense, not to prove anything, but to affirm they belonged to each other. Elena wrapped her arms around him, resting her head on his chest, listening to his strong heartbeat, a rhythm she now knew was for her. They stood there, under the twinkling lights on the terrace, surrounded by her small plants and memories of the past 10 years. The city buzzed below, but for them, there was only the stillness of happiness. Mason whispered in her ear, "I'll never make you wait another second." Elena smiled, replying, "I believe you." Elena and Mason's journey wasn't just a story of love returned. It was a lesson in appreciation and awakening. Elena had spent 10 years loving silently, sacrificing without asking, but it was her choice to leave that made Mason see her worth. Her love wasn't weakness, but strength. The strength to wait, to hope, and finally to let go when needed. Mason, in turn, learned that love isn't a given. He'd been blind to Elena's presence, but loss taught him to look into his heart, to value what he'd once taken for granted. Their story reminds us that true love isn't just a feeling, but a choice to stay, to mend mistakes, and to build happiness from cracks. Elena and Mason had crossed misunderstandings, pain, and distance to find each other, and their perfect ending proved that love, when returned, can heal all wounds and turn dreams into reality. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.